I asked ChatGPT the top 5 hip flexor stretches to improve hip tightness. Let's rank them. Hi, I'm Alex Effer, founder of Resilient Training and Rehab, and I've helped thousands of coaches and clinicians get faster and more consistent results with their clients. Let's get into it. So let's start with the most popular exercise. That's going to be the half kneeling hip flexor stretch. So essentially with this exercise, you're putting your knee down, the other leg is marched up, and you're just pushing your hips forward. They even cue to squeeze your glute as tight as you can. In my opinion, this is more of a D tier. I see some value in being in a half kneeling position, but the fact of the matter is what a lot of people are trying to do here by squeezing the glute, you're actually just pushing your body forward. A lot of times when people have hip flexor tightness, it's because their center of gravity is already really far forward. And their glutes are probably not in a position to work because the pelvis is dumping forward. So by pushing your hip forward even more, doing a glute squeeze, it's probably not that effective. Also, you're not actually addressing the root cause. So as I said, the half kneeling position is actually not a bad position. It's actually a pretty great position in order to restore hip extension, but it has to be done potentially in a different way. In my opinion, a lot of people don't have the hip extension to even get into this position. So they arch their back or they flare their ribs when they're doing it. Instead, we should probably be talking about other exercises that are more appropriate for them. So the next exercise is the couch stretch. I actually don't mind the couch stretch. I would probably put that as a C tier when done in the right way. So again, a lot of times people don't have the hip extension, and when they don't have hip extension, they probably also don't have knee flexion. So done too early, a lot of people complain about discomfort on their knee, or they're just flaring their ribs excessively, because what this exercise is doing is it's really trying to stretch a muscle called your rectus femoris. This muscle attaches to the lowest part of your knee to the top part of the hip. It's the only quad muscle that crosses two joints. And so when they're doing this, if they have tension going through the quads, because their center of gravity is really far forward towards their toes, again, they're just gonna really arch through their lower back in order to get into this position. I like using this position when I've already restored some range of motion at the hip, where they can get into a certain amount of hip extension and they can bend their knee. You can see in previous videos, I've talked about how to restore knee flexion as well as how to restore hip extension. So go check out those videos because it's really gonna apply to this. I like using this to reinforce hip extension when somebody already has a decent amount. Or when somebody's doing a split squat and when they bring their back leg back, they're still arching through their lower back. This is a great exercise in order to restore that, but it's not one of my first exercises, which is why I'm ranking it as a C tier. The third most popular exercise is the standard glute bridge. For me, this is a D tier. The reason why is because a lot of times people don't have that hip extension, just trying to force that motion. You're just gonna be doing it through the lower back and as well as through the rib cage. Also, a lot of people think that hip flexor tightness is going to be overcome by strengthening the glutes. This is that stretch strengthen model. And this is very skewed. It's not a really great model to follow because the hip flexors are only tight because the center of mass is going towards the toes. And the muscles just react to the joint position. So instead, if we restore the joint position, we're gonna naturally just reduce the tension on the hip flexors. If I'm trying to engage my glutes, that's gonna push me more forward towards my toes. So a lot of times, again, when you see people do this, they're just arching through their lower rib cage, they're arching through their lower back. So we need to be thinking about how can we shift the center of gravity back, actually opening up the hips more, opening up the glutes, so that I can take the pressure off of those muscles that are just trying to hold me from falling over. The next exercise is a 90-90 hip opener. I actually would classify this as more of a B tier exercise, not because of the hip flexion portion of it, but because what it's doing to the hips itself. As you can see, the setup is you got one leg resting on the outside, one leg resting on the inside. So initially I showed you with the right knee down, left leg open, and then both arms on either side of that leg. What this is going to do is this is going to turn my pelvis towards the left. It's great for somebody who has a pelvis that's turning towards the right. And what I would do instead of just hanging out into a stretch is I would make it more active. I'd make sure I'm getting tall through my rib cage so I'm able to open up my back, and I'm pushing my knee into the ground on the down leg so I'm able to really get that rotation away from that side. Am I gonna feel a huge hip flexor stretch? No, but I'm gonna feel the right muscles working, which is my groin. I'm gonna be feeling my anterior glute med, which is a muscle that helps internally rotate the hip, which is naturally just gonna counteract muscles like the psoas, but it's gonna do so by putting the joint in the right position. I'm gonna get that hip extension without trying to force through this bundle of tissue. I'm gonna do it by actually putting the joints in the right position to create the rotation. A lot of these hip flexor stretches are meant to try to create rotation, but people are just squeezing their glutes and they're arching their back. That's going to naturally limit that rotation, especially if the glutes are already tight or the center of gravity is really far forward. So instead, we need to be thinking about how can I push myself back and then drive the rotation, which is why I think this is a B tier exercise. Before I get to the last exercise, if you actually want to restore your posture by doing it the right way, then check out my Resilient Posture program. We've helped over 700 people already start to restore their body, feeling better without any type of stretching. So if that relates to you, then click the link below to get started. Let's get to the fifth exercise. So the fifth ranked exercise is more of a loaded exercise. It's a lunge with a side bend. So again, this is just more of an active version of the half kneeling stretch where I'm really trying to squeeze the glute in order to open up the hip flexor, and they have a little bit of a side bend away from that side to further open up the rib cage. You know, I put this as a D category, and upon thinking about it, because I put this in D, I'm gonna rechange my order. I'm gonna put the glute bridge into an F category because I just really think that most people butcher it. And I just don't think that people have the capacity to actually do that kind of movement, nor do I think that it actually drives you closer to what you're actually trying to achieve. So I put this lunge with a stretch as a D category. Again, people are really forcing that hip extension. Most people don't even have it. You're squeezing the glute. You're trying to drive rotation, which is why it's not F, because I like the idea of trying to drive this rotation, trying to drive hip extension. It's just not being done in the most accurate way or not being done in the best way possible to try to drive that change. So let's talk about the A tier before we talk about the S tier. The A tier, in my opinion, is going to be an exercise called the armbar. By rotating over top of the bottom leg, we're naturally going to turn the pelvis back on that side. We're going to restore some internal rotation, but as we roll back, we're then going to take all that motion we've created and we're going to use it to drive hip extension. Again, this is not an exercise where you're going to be feeling a lot of tension, a lot of stretching. A lot of times when people feel that huge stretching, it's probably not just because the muscle's tight, but maybe the muscle is holding you back to prevent you from going even more forward. It's a protective mechanism. Whereas this arm bar is gonna open up the joint ranges of motion by improving internal rotation of the hip, improving external rotation of the hip, all while holding your rib cage back so you're not able to flare your ribs. So I would say this is a A-tier exercise because it's incorporating everything, but actually using the right muscles to work to change the position of the joint. So now let's talk about the S-tier exercise. This is when I really like using split squats, but in a constrained way. So we're gonna talk about the front foot elevated split squat with the wall supported hold. So essentially what we're gonna do, we're gonna have our front foot forward on a small box and we're gonna have our back leg supported. By having that back leg supported, I'm not gonna be pushing the wall too hard, but just enough to maintain the position. By being front foot elevated, that's naturally going to decompress the front hip. If I can decompress the front hip, then I'm able to open up the back side of the hip, which is gonna shift me back, and it's also gonna take pressure off of the hip flexor. By reaching something in front of me, I'm also gonna push myself back towards my heels. As I mentioned, people who have stiff hip flexors are always in their toes. So if I can bring them back towards their heels and have them more in a supported position, I'm gonna naturally reduce tension on those muscles and use the right muscles plus the right joint action to restore that motion. So in this video, we talked about what ChatGPT ranks as the top hip flexor stretches. And it just goes to show that Although AI is amazingly helpful to understand certain things, it's not going to be the greatest at selecting exercises, just like most people, because most people aren't really good at selecting exercises anyway. So understanding these principles are going to allow us to pick better exercises, categorize them in a way so that we can start to understand how these things are picked in the right way. If this was helpful, don't forget to like, save, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.